In the spring of 1879, a man returned from his winter camp alone. He had previously set off into the wilderness with his family. When he returned, he would tell the story of how the other members of his family had starved to death over the winter, that he had just barely managed to survive on his own. The winters on the frontier can be harsh and had been known to claim the lives of many in the past. But for someone who claimed to have nearly starved to death himself, this man appeared to be in remarkably good condition. Eventually, the police would get involved, and that's when the story began to unravel. This is the tale of Swift Runner. The province of Alberta, Canada has a history thousands of years old, with the ancestors of today's First Nations arriving in the area by at least 10,000 BC. European explorers would appear in the area in the 1750s as the fur trade expanded across western North America. Two companies, the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, began building trading posts in the last quarter of the 18th century along the major northern rivers before the companies merged in 1821. As in many other places around North America, the arrival of missionaries and white settlers in the region caused some tension, to put it mildly, especially with them taking over more and more land and trying to drive the indigenous people away. The relationship was strenuous at best. And it is in this climate that we find a Cree hunter and trapper named Co.AG, or Swift Runner. Little is known about his early life. In fact, if we're perfectly honest here, this entire story is not that well known. It's mostly a patchwork of various different sources. But let's take a look at it. This is the story that is most often told. Born in around 1839, Swift Runner was well known around Fort Saskatchewan settlement. He led a pretty regular life. He had a wife and 6 children. He was over 6 feet tall, and as such, he made a pretty imposing figure, but by all accounts, he was well liked among the people living in the area, as well as among the traders of the Hudson's Bay Company that he worked with. This was pretty common practice at the time. In exchange for beaver pelts and buffalo hides, European traders would offer the natives guns and tools. And having learned how to hunt when he was a boy, Swift Runner was skilled enough to make a decent living hunting and trading. He was said to be mild-mannered, soft-spoken, and developed a reputation for being trustworthy. That reputation would even lead to him serving as a guide for the Northwest Mounted Police once they were established in the area. But as it turned out, this would be the beginning of the end for Swift Runner. As one newspaper reporting on this event would put it, his contact with white men ruined him. You see, the Northwest Mounted Police had been established in 1873 as a federal law enforcement agency in Canada in order to maintain order in the Northwest Territories. Initially, the main focus was to deal with the illegal whiskey trade, as whiskey had been smuggled into the area disguised as medicine and has such become a big problem in the area. Realizing that the First Nations people knew the hills and the forests there much better than they did, the Northwest Mounted Police approached the Cree to ask if anyone among them would be willing to be a guide for them. With his reputation of being trustworthy, his skill as a hunter, and his knowledge of the land, the Cree recommended Swift Runner, and when he was asked, he readily agreed. Unfortunately, this turned out to be a mistake. Swift Runner soon developed an addiction to whiskey himself, and it quickly took over his life. To make matters worse, his personality would shift whenever he was drinking. going from being known as mild-mannered and trustworthy to gaining a reputation as a troublemaker, as aggressive and violent. Now he was reportedly known as the terror of the whole region, with even the police giving him a wide berth. His violent tendencies eventually got so bad that he was fired from his job as a guide for the police and sent back to his tribe. His alcoholism only got worse, leading him to cause just as much havoc among his own people as he had for the police. Reportedly, it all came to a head when he reportedly tried to kill a trader on Christmas Eve, 1878. He was arrested and kept locked up until he sobered up. When he was sent home, his people had also made the decision that this was too much. They could not deal with this anymore. He was supposedly told that when they were moving with the buffalo, he would not go with them. His family, however, would be allowed to come with. This did nothing to stop his bad behavior, and finally they just had enough, and he was kicked out of the tribe. Swift Runner then took his family, which consisted of his wife, his 6 children, his mother or possibly even mother-in-law, his brother or possibly brother-in-law. The sources are unclear, but for consistency we will say mother and brother here, as that is the most common way they are described. They went out into the harsh wilderness to spend the winter there. The winter would pass without a word from him or his family. Then, several months later, in the spring of 1879, Swift Runner would stagger into the Cree encampment at Manawan Lake. When asked why his family was not with him, he said that his entire family was dead, that they hadn't been able to find any food and had starved to death over the winter, that he had just barely managed to survive himself. Swift Runner would later tell the same story to the missionaries at St. Albert. Everyone who heard this story knew that it wasn't an unlikely scenario. Tragedies like the one Swift Runner was speaking about weren't unheard of. The winters could be harsh and had been known to claim the lives of those caught in it. But there were a few things about this story that both the Cree and the missionaries could not shake. The first was that Swift Runner did not look like a man who had starved. In fact, the opposite was true. He seemed to be in very good condition for someone who survived the ordeal that he claimed to have survived. Another thing that raised alarm among the missionaries was the interest that Swift Runner took in the orphaned native children that were staying at the mission. These children had been orphaned following a smallpox epidemic that swept through the country only a couple of years earlier. Swift Runner would reportedly tell these children stories of his fine camp in the woods, which struck the adults as very odd, given that his family had supposedly starved. He would allegedly even offer to take the children on a trip to that camp, but the missionaries had declined. The final thing that struck people as alarming were the nightmares that Swift Runner claimed to be plagued by. Ominous, disturbing nightmares that unsettled everyone who heard about him. All in all, people began worrying that something sinister had happened to Swift Runner's family. This worry eventually grew to suspicion, which meant that the police became involved. They arrested the hunter and brought him to the fort for questioning. Initially, they were told the exact same story as everyone else had been. But like everyone else, the police only grew more and more suspicious. Finally, they told him that the only way for him to prove that his story was true was for him to lead them to where his family was in the wilderness. Now backed into a corner, Swift Runner agreed. A 3-man crew was tasked with taking Swift Runner to his camp. After about 30 or 40 miles, they began to realize that Swift Runner was trying to lead them away from a particular section of forest. This made them think that he was not willing to actually lead them to his camp. So they decided to use another method, and they would get him intoxicated and making him promise to lead them to the camp. They would set out early in the morning. Swift Runner was supposedly still under the influence at this point, and he would lead the party towards the thickest part of the bush. According to one source, as soon as they drew closer to the camp, Swift Runner would stop, throw back his head, and make a sound that was similar to a wolf-like howl. Police started suspecting that they were close to the camp, so they began to search the immediate vicinity. It wasn't long before the camp was discovered, and like much in this case, sources vary on where exactly the camp was located, but the location isn't as important as what they found in that camp. They found Swift Runner's moose hide teepee, which was folded and draped neatly over a tree branch. This drew the police's attention because one detail that Swift Runner had told them was that he had boiled and eaten the teepee in an attempt to fight off starvation. But here it was, seemingly intact. They would also find some of his traps. Then they stumbled upon an old campfire, which is where the more horrifying discovery was made. Scattered all over the camp were piles of human bones, which appeared to have been boiled and even had traces of human teeth marks on them. They found femurs and other long bones which had all been smashed open with the marrow sucked out. They found 8 human skulls, hair and clothing, all of which had been boiled. Some of the skulls even appeared to have been smashed open with either an axe or possibly a tomahawk, as if the attacker had tried to extract the brain. Within the campfire itself, the investigators found a pile of rotting, half-charred entrails. The nearby trees were even stained with greasy finger marks. And not only that, but according to some sources, they found other things that were apparently too gruesome to repeat. Swift Runner would still maintain the story that his family had died of starvation, even now confronted with this scene. But he changed his story somewhat and did admit that he had eaten their bodies. But he claimed that he only did so after they had already died, and only to sustain himself. He also told them that the eldest of his children, his teenaged son, had been the first to die, and he had not been eaten. Instead, he had been buried about 1.5 miles from the spot where they now stood. That grave and the body was found exactly where Swift Runner said it would be. The body showed signs of having died from starvation. The remains of the rest of the family were also buried in the area around the main camp. The 8 skulls, though, they were taken in for evidence. Swift Runner was then swiftly brought back to be interrogated. With the skulls laid out on a table, the police questioned him about what really happened. At first, he maintained the same story and allegedly showed absolutely no remorse. But eventually, he started to tell them what really happened. He told them that he had killed and eaten his wife and 5 children. He told them that his eldest son had died from starvation, which had been confirmed by the police. He told them that he had no idea who the additional 2 skulls were, and denied that he had any idea what happened to his mother or his brother. He claimed that they had split off from the group prior to the killing of his family, and that he had no idea what happened to them. This is the story that he told. According to Swift Runner, they had survived up until February. He had felled plenty of moose and bears to keep the family fed. But around February, he had fallen sick, and as such was unable to hunt. To make matters worse, the others couldn't find anything to hunt either. This eventually led to them having to kill their dogs and eat them. Once he had recovered from his illness, Swiftrunner had traveled to a post on the Athabasca River where he got some provisions. But they were meager and wouldn't last long. The family soon felt hunger creeping in once again. His brother then allegedly decided to leave with his mother to see if they could find some game. They would not come back. Now, Swiftrunner was alone with his family. After spending days with nothing to eat, he allegedly told his wife to take the kids and try to find the others. He figured that he had a better chance of surviving if he was by himself. The rest of the family agreed and left, with the exception of his 10-year-old son, who chose to stay with him. More days would pass without food, and Swiftrunner was at this point driven near mad with hunger. So much so that when he woke early one morning, he found himself looking at his sleeping son and made a decision. He grabbed his gun and shot the boy. The bullet entered his head. Taking a knife, Swiftrunner would then sink it into the boy's side twice. Somehow, the boy was still alive. Swiftrunner would then grab a stick and ended the boy's life. For days afterwards, he would sustain himself by eating the child. At some point after that, he stumbled upon his wife and remaining children. When asked where their son were, he told his wife that he had died of starvation, but he felt that they did not believe him. 3 days after being reunited with his family, his eldest son would die of starvation. They dug a grave and buried him. They would then try boiling pieces of their tent, shoes, and buffalo robes in order to try to sustain themselves. According to Swiftrunner, his family had not been able to shake the fear that he had killed the 10-year-old, and he soon realized that they were planning to leave him once again. This made him angry, so much so that he got up early one morning and grabbed his gun. He shot his wife in the chest before grabbing a hatchet to take the lives of his 3 daughters. The only one left now was his 7-year-old. Swiftrunner woke him up and told him to collect snow for water. Too weak and most likely too terrified to do anything else, the boy obeyed. They would then live for about 7 or 8 days eating the dead. Spring was now steadily approaching. The snow was melting, migrant birds were now returning, which meant that they were able to find something else to eat. This also meant that they would soon have to return to the settlement. He apparently told his son that he would be seen as a murderer, but that no harm would come to the boy. This was a lie. One day, when they were getting closer to Egg Lake, where some relatives lived, Swiftrunner would tell his son to fetch something. The child did, and as he did, Swiftrunner grabbed his gun and killed the last of his children before eating him. He never admitted to killing his mother or his brother, holding firm to his statement that they had left. But the number of skulls found at the campsite definitely indicated to the police that he had in fact killed and eaten them too. Swiftrunner would be tried for the murder of his family in the summer of 1879. In the jury were 3 English-speaking Cree Métis, 3 white men who spoke the Cree language, and a Cree man who translated the proceedings to make sure that Swiftrunner would know what was being said. Swiftrunner kept calm, offering no defense for his actions beyond what he had told them of the evil spirit. On August 8, 1879, Swiftrunner was sentenced to be hanged. The hanging was set to take place on December 20th that same year. This was the first legal hanging in the Canadian Northwest Territories. Until then, he would be kept in a jail cell, where he allegedly unsettled some of the guards with how he kept staring at them. It was a cold morning of December 20th when Swiftrunner was led from his cell into the yard. It was still dark out and snow covered the ground. Many had gathered to watch the hanging. Most of them had never even seen a hanging before and had no idea what would happen. The sheriff had been delayed by the weather, which only added to the nervous atmosphere. Even the hangman, a retired police officer, was nervous about the whole thing. No matter how much nervousness was lingering in the air, the sentence was carried out about 2 hours after Swiftrunner had been led to the gallows. His body would be left hanging for about an hour before it was cut down and buried in the snow outside the fort, though where exactly that is unknown. Now we get to the part of the story that is the most well-known, the part of the story that most seem to focus on when they retell the tale. This has led to the story being sensationalized. The creature that he spoke of has become a scary monster in horror in later years. One prominent example is in games like Until Dawn, almost to the point where people have kind of forgotten where the creature actually comes from. It's important to remember that when Swiftrunner spoke of this creature, of being possessed, of having nightmares, he was not referring to a westernized monster. He was talking about, and was afraid of, a curse. One that he claimed took hold of him whenever he committed his crimes. One that apparently had been tormenting him for years. A curse that is still very much an active belief in many indigenous cultures today. I should also state that the story of him being an alcoholic is also one you see most often in the sources about this case. But that detail actually does clash with some other sources, such as Royal Canadian Mounted Police historian J.P. Turner, who writes in his 1950 History of the Northwest Mounted Police that Swiftrunner had suffered abnormally from troubled dreams, one of the most insidious curses of indigenous life. According to the book, Swiftrunner would see, or think he saw, some of the spirits. Foremost among these was the spirit that urged him to indulge in cannibalism. Turner doesn't write anything about the supposed alcoholism. Instead, he focuses on these nightmares that supposedly haunted Swiftrunner. He also makes no mention of Swiftrunner being chased out of his community. Instead, he simply states that in the autumn of 1878, Swiftrunner, his wife, and his children would move to new trapping grounds on the left bank of Sturgeon Creek. This is what I meant when I said in the beginning that this story is a patchwork of varying sources. But, and keep in mind that I'm just speculating here, but it is possible that the truth is somewhere in the middle, that he did suffer from these horrible nightmares, which later in life would become worse if he succumbed to an alcohol addiction. Whenever Swiftrunner spoke of the evil deeds that he did, he often spoke of how this evil spirit took control of him, compelled him to do what he did. Like Turner writes in his book, he had been tormented for years by this evil spirit, this malevolent curse, and he never wavered from that. That was the one thing that he never changed. This, of course, has meant that in the years following the massacre and his sentencing, historians have tried to make sense of it all. Reportedly, Swiftrunner showed no signs of any insanity, which begs the question, why did he do what he did? First, let's look at this creature, which is a malevolent, cannibalistic spirit that can reportedly possess a human, originating in Algonquian folklore, but it can be found in the folklore of other native people. It is said that it causes its victims to feel an insatiable hunger for the flesh of other humans, to be specific. And if you ever gave in to this hunger, you would never be satisfied, always searching for your next victim, new flesh to eat. This, as I said, is still an active belief among indigenous people today, and I have no reason to doubt that Swiftrunner believed this too. A study published in the journal Curious gave a different perspective on the whole thing, stating that this is a psychosis that is deeply embedded in the traditions of Algonquian-speaking tribes that is marked by paranoia, anxiety, hallucinations, and cannibalistic impulses, that it emerged from a blend of cultural narratives and psychological vulnerabilities. I feel the need to point out, though, that this study is controversial. And a big reason for that is how it seems to target the indigenous people specifically, as if this is unique to them, which it isn't. Cannibalism is not a unique thing that only happens to indigenous people in North America. Look at the whale ship Essex. They had to resort to cannibalism to survive on the open ocean. In fact, among sailors at that time, cannibalism was something that they were very aware of, as was the general public. It was something that was begrudgingly accepted as a way of surviving ship disasters. In the case of Swift Runner, based on his own account, the first kill was a decision that he made in the moment. His wife's death was caused by him getting angry, perhaps even the death of his daughters too. But it was just him, he alone, who did it. It was not a group trying to survive. There may be other factors that could have played a part if we're trying to understand why. For instance, Swift Runner's alcohol abuse, withdrawal from that and the effects that could have had, especially in combination with the horrific nightmares that he suffered and the mental toll the cold and the starvation might have taken on him. In the end, though, we will never know for sure why Swift Runner did what he did. Was it psychosis? An evil spirit? A combination of various factors, perhaps. As far as Swift Runner's kinsmen were concerned, he had been possessed by this evil cannibalistic spirit, which led to his murderous rampage. It's important to remember that regardless of the why, innocents were killed in a horrific crime that has left a mark in history. It's been nearly 150 years since this happened, but the horror of it lingers. Not just in the potential shape of an evil spirit, but in the wake of a human being who committed a horrific crime.